Okay, good evening, everyone. It's 6:05, and this is a good moment to start the session. Welcome to the 2023 annual lecture of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, in short, CSSGJ. My name is Andreas Bieler, and I'm one of the three co-directors of the center, and it's my pleasure to chair this evening's session. Now, this year's annual lecture is presented jointly to you by CSSGJ together with Global Justice Now. Global Justice Now, many of you will know about the organization, campaigns to change the rules of the global economy. And of course, this evening's talk will also directly deal with that. Now, the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice itself is an independent research center dedicated to research on social and global justice. And in our talks, we have a seminar series, a weekly seminar series. And if you want information about that, you can find that at our website address, cssgj.org. We always combine academic presentations from a critical theoretical, critical political economy perspective with seminars where activists report from their engagements and struggles. And so this evening speaker is, of course, ideal for the center because in a way he combines both. He combines the academic rigor in his research with a very clear activist angle, being the director of Global Justice Now. So it's my pleasure to welcome Nick Dearden to this year's annual lecture. He's going to speak about his recently published book. I've got a hard copy here with me, Pharmanomics, How Big Pharma Destroys Global Health. So we can already see the kind of activist angle which comes in here. Now, how do we proceed? Well, Nick has about 40 minutes for his presentation, followed by a Q&A session of about roughly the same amount of time, and then we will complete the annual lecture punctually at 7:30. Now, both the chat and the Q&A functions are open. The chat, you can use it if you want to say where you're from, if you want to greet some friends, colleagues. The Q&A function will be important for when we get to the period after Nick's talk, because you can then ask it by writing into the Q&A function, and I will read out the questions for Nick, who is then going to respond directly to it. So welcome again, everyone. Welcome, Nick. The floor is yours. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andreas, and thanks to the Centre for hosting this. We really wanted to do an online launch of the book because I've been around the country talking about this. And so the invite to do this was extremely welcome because you've done some of my work for me in organising this. So thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be doing it. And I should say at the beginning, the inspiration of this book was obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, but actually my organization had been working on the problems with the pharmaceutical industry for 3 or 4 years before that, because we recognized that this was such a broken industry, such a dysfunctional system and model for making the drugs that we all rely on at one time or another in our lives, particularly disastrous for the global south. And I suppose COVID came along after we'd been working on this for a few years, and we realized the dangers of allowing this industry to control the vaccine rollout in what was, the worst pandemic that humanity has seen in a century. And we were deeply concerned about what was going to happen. And I think our concerns were more than justified. But I wanted to write this book to make sure that we learnt the lessons of that pandemic. And I should say, very little of this is original thinking. And I need to extend enormous thanks and acknowledge the work of health justice activists, pharma campaign activists around the world, who helped me with this and who really led the movement for COVID justice. You know, we came together in something called the People's Vaccine Alliance, which many of you will know about and were campaigning in. And in that alliance, you know, there were many leaders of what had been the AIDS, HIV activist movement from the late 90s and early 2000s. And I think without those incredibly brave and effective and inspirational activists, we would not have had anything like the campaign that we had in the pandemic. So, you know, I really want to acknowledge them and express my gratitude to them and some of their voices. If you want to read the book after this, you'll hear firsthand in the book itself, and I know some of you are online tonight. So I wanted to tell the story of how vaccines were developed in the pandemic, how other treatments to COVID-19 were developed in the pandemic, how they were rolled out, and what, as I say, what we need to learn from that. And I think that's important because there is a common story which you hear from the pharmaceutical lobbyists, from certain politicians and bits of the media, and it goes something like this. We invented COVID vaccines in record time. We then got those vaccines into people's arms on a mass scale in record time. And isn't this a wonderful example of how much you need the ingenuity of big pharmaceutical corporations? True, what we do isn't always cheap, they say, but at least we come up with the goods. And it's, you know, what we do is at the cutting edge of scientific achievement. All human progress relies upon that. And you don't get any of that without investors, without markets allocating capital on the basis of the good return that they hope for from their work. So that's the story that's commonly told about how we got COVID vaccines. And I think it was actually, for once, summed up rather pithily by the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, when he said, "It was greed, my friends, which brought us the vaccine." And I wanted to show that it wasn't greed that brought us the vaccine. And actually, what COVID exposed more than anything else was a near complete market failure. And in fact, without massive state intervention, we would have had no vaccines because those vaccines were not created by the corporations that came to bear their names. In fact, there's a lovely quote that I got from the Financial Times, and it's a US government official who's trying to procure vaccines in the middle of the pandemic from Pfizer, a US company. And you kind of imagine this guy tearing his hair out in these negotiations because Pfizer's trying to charge him $100 a shot, so $200 a patient. And he says, you know, it's not even their vaccine. The fact we call it Pfizer's vaccine has to be the biggest marketing coup in the history of the American pharmaceutical industry. And what's true of Pfizer's vaccine is true of all the vaccines: the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the Moderna vaccine. You know, none of them were created thanks to the private capital and entrepreneurship of those companies at all. And I take a look back and go back to 2016, when the World Health Organization issued a warning. And it said, look, next to no proper research is being done by the pharmaceutical industry into any one of the 16 really dangerous pathogens that we fear could create a serious health epidemic in coming years. 2 years later, a journalist went back. This was supposed to be a wake-up call to the pharmaceutical industry. And what are you doing? This is what you're here for. 2 years later, a journalist goes back and tries to and works out whether it's had any effect whatsoever. And the short answer is it hasn't. Still no research being done into any of this, including coronaviruses. No big pharma company was doing any research into coronaviruses, despite the fact coronaviruses, of course, had actually caused health epidemics in other parts of the world, in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. There was research being done, and thank God it was, because without that we would have had no vaccines at all. That was being done largely by university departments with public money, or by fairly small biotech companies, normally with a fairly large injection of public money. And then the pandemic broke out. And we had to translate that research into viable vaccines, test them, trial them, and so on and so forth. And at that point, unprecedented amounts of public money were poured into that task. So the American government alone put $16-17 billion in. But unfortunately, we did what our societies so often do, our governments so often do, rather than ensuring the knowledge behind those vaccines remained open to use for anybody who wants it, to collaborate on and create something even better than what we'd got. It was effectively privatized. It was handed over to the big pharmaceutical corporations, who then walled off this knowledge that we so desperately needed. And thanks to international patent rules, which I'll come back to, effectively got to decide how many vaccines would be produced and where they would be produced, who would get to buy those vaccines, and what price they'd pay for them. In other words, decisions with massive implications for everybody on the planet were taken in pretty much the most unaccountable, untransparent, and undemocratic way you can imagine. And indeed, there's still virtually no transparency around how some of those decisions were made. And I argue in the book, and more generally in my life, this is a huge problem. It's not simply that these corporations are making astronomical profits out of their products, and I'll come back to that. Far, far higher returns than the average company can expect to make. It's that life and death decisions are being made not on the basis of public interest in a democratic, open, and transparent way, but on the basis of how much return corporate executives can make for their shareholders. And that's an atrocious way to run a vaccine rollout in the worst pandemic in a century. But more broadly, in our economy, all sorts of decisions are taken in these ways. And if my organization, Global Justice Now, is campaigning on any one thing, it is to stop decisions being made in this way, to stop our economy being run for the benefit of super rich investors and shareholders, and actually translate those decisions into a more democratic form of decision making. In the pandemic, what this form of decision making meant was very, very straightforward. Almost all of the sales of the mRNA vaccines, for example, from Pfizer and Moderna, went to the richest countries in the world. There was almost nothing for anybody else. And we raised that at the time as part of the People's Vaccine Movement. And the companies came back and said, well, okay, yeah, we get it, but don't worry too much. Hopefully, those countries will have taken all they need very soon, and we can get on to all the other countries in the world. And we realized, I guess it was 2 years ago now, when people like me had got our third dose, and even more vulnerable people in our societies had got their fourth dose. And yet many countries in the world had not even been able to offer a single dose to their frontline health workers or scientists. It was then clear that it wasn't just us first, it was us first, second, third, and fourth. And everybody else in the world was really irrelevant in terms of decision that these companies were making. But actually, I think it gets worse than that. And this goes to the heart of the political economy of the pharmaceutical industry, because not only did we fail to sell vaccines to the majority of the world, not only did we completely fail to donate vaccines to the rest of the world. I mean, outside the United States, there were no significant donations made to the rest of the world, and even the United States donations were not enough. So not only didn't we sell them, not only didn't we donate them, but we actively prevented most countries in the world being able to produce their own versions of these vaccines, because we walled off the knowledge and we refused to share it, or at least the companies who were sitting on that knowledge did. There was a piece of research done by some friends, and they found out that 100 factories around the world could have safely produced mRNA vaccines. The corporations, Pfizer and Moderna, who sat on that technology, were asked whether they would share it, and they refused to do so. So supply of vaccines was artificially limited in the pandemic, and the result was disastrous for many parts of the world. But it was very, very good for the companies that were making those vaccines. And I think that's really the heart of why we've got a system, a global economy structured in this way, because it's essentially an economy which is made in the interests of big corporate monopolies. They're the ones who wrote these rules in the first place. For Pfizer, for a company like Pfizer, just in the first year that their vaccine was on sale, they brought in $36 billion. Second year, they added an antiviral treatment for COVID. And those two products alone in 1 year brought in $50 billion for Pfizer. Several of Moderna's board of executives, including its chief executive, became multi-billionaires as a result of their vaccine, the one product they had on the market. And because nobody else could produce them, they were able to charge pretty much whatever they could get away with. Now, they didn't quite get away with charging $100 a dose to the US. They pushed back on that. But they did sell for about £20 a shot in the first wave, vaccines that Pfizer itself claimed they could have made for just under £5 a shot. And we've got scientists who say, even that's a massive overestimate, and actually you could have made it for something more like 75 pence. That's a huge markup, £20 a shot. And that was a special pandemic price. We now know that they are charging the US government more like £70 a shot. And they're charging some in the US and private insurers and so on more than that. So, these corporations made a fortune for their investors by enclosing knowledge they hadn't even created and creating a vaccine apartheid, which I would argue claimed the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people unnecessarily. But it's had a bigger effect, not just the effect that is experienced by people in the global south, but actually it's affected in a fundamental way how these companies operate. And I want to just take a little bit of time to explain this, because I think that for me, the really stark finding from this book is that what you have in the big players in the pharmaceutical industry isn't really something that you would call drug development companies at all. I mean, drug development almost seems to be a bit of a sideline for these companies, really. Really, they are far more akin to hedge funds. They don't, by and large, invent new medicines. The public sector does that through universities. Small companies do that. We put tons of public investment into them. The development of those drugs is often done by small biotech companies. But what these really big players do is they then buy up those other companies that have done that work. They buy up the intellectual property. They buy up the monopolies to make those drugs. And then they sit on that intellectual property and they squeeze it for all it's worth, whatever the consequences for whether people can access those medicines or not. And one of the things I argue in the book, and it may be something people want to discuss, is I don't think this is simply a problem confined to the pharmaceutical industry. I think this is a form of financialisation which actually affects large swathes of our economy. But I do think the pharmaceutical industry was kind of in the vanguard of this big change that happened, this financialisation that happened from the late 1980s, early 1990s onwards. And I want to explain that a bit. So you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, and the pharmaceutical industry was doing a fair amount of research. It was inventing drugs. Now, I don't want to overplay this. The companies at that time, many of whom are the same companies that we know today in one form or another, they weren't angels by a very long way. They were extremely powerful corporations, and they used that power sometimes in deeply inappropriate ways to make massive amounts of profit. So a really good example of this, I think, is Purdue Pharma, which has become really famous now, infamous, thanks to a number of documentaries. If people have got a Netflix subscription, definitely watch Painkiller or Dope Sick. Really incredible dramas about what happened in America. But effectively here, you've got a company which invented an unbelievably strong painkiller, not that far off heroin, called OxyContin. They then went out of their way to sell as many of these painkillers that really should have been restricted to end of life pain, serious cancer pain. I mean, they should be giving out very sparingly indeed. They went out of their way to claim there was no addictive quality to OxyContin, and even if you've got the most mild of pain, probably try one. Corrupting parts of the medical establishment along the way, and that has led to the most incredible crisis, healthcare catastrophe in the United States, where 300,000 people have died of drug overdoses, many from prescription painkillers, and even those that weren't, many of them started out their addiction through OxyContin. So this is a terrible scandal. But in some ways, it's quite an old-fashioned scandal, because OxyContin invented this drug and then they behaved really atrociously in the way that they marketed it. In the 90s, that kind of changed, because pharmaceutical executives, corporate executives, kind of recognized that what was really important, what was really valuable, what was really profitable about their operation wasn't actually their research and development. It wasn't their manufacturing capacity, their productive capacity, their ability to make drugs. It wasn't, their educated staff force. What it was essentially their intellectual property, their monopolies. And this was something that all sorts of companies were kind of discovering at this time. So, I mean, it made me remember Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, which I went back to, and I would definitely recommend others go back to it, because I think it's a phenomenal book for its time, in that she really spotted that this was going on, and says in that book, look, the way capitalism works, the way business works is changing, and actually the thing that we assume they are making money from, the thing that we assume is important to them, isn't that important anymore. So McDonald's, makes hamburgers that aren't that different to anyone else's hamburgers. The reason McDonald's enjoys the immense amount of profits it does is its monopoly position, and that in turn is based on a set of kind of intangibles, what are called intangible assets in the organization, things like brand, essentially trademarks. Same with Levi's. Levi's jeans, they're made in the same factories as everyone else's jeans. What's important for Levi's is its intangible assets, its brand. And you can store those brands wherever you want. You can put them in tax havens, whatever, to move them around the world to maximize your profits from them. Now, the pharmaceutical industry is a little bit different. Their names aren't as well known to us as McDonald's or Levi's, but nonetheless, there is an intangible asset at the heart of the pharmaceutical industry, which is, responsible for the vast majority of the profits of that industry, and that's intellectual property, that's its patents. Particularly, they've got some trademarks, but essentially, it's the patents that give them a real monopoly of at least 20 years on any medicine that they control the rights to. And so, recognizing this, the corporate executives said, "Well, okay, maybe we can cut back on our research and development. Maybe we can cut back on our productive capacity on our factories. Maybe we can cut back on our staff. What we really need is investment, so that we can buy up the intellectual property that's been created elsewhere that we think we have a reasonable chance of exploiting for huge amounts of money." And that's what they did. They went on a spending spree, fueled by debt, to buy up, through mergers and acquisitions, buy up other companies. And they still do this today, and end up sitting on intellectual property, and the bits of the research that they buy up, the bits that they think are the most profitable are the bits that they take forward. But in the process, they have also found themselves completely in hock to the interests of the financial sector, of the big investors, the big asset managers, and the BlackRocks and so on and so forth, who expect a large return. And that says something about the nature of capitalism today, because capitalism today isn't just a company that produces cars competing against other companies that produce cars to make their cars the most cost effective and promote them as well as they can. Companies today are competing against all other companies for investment and for debt, which is fueling the whole economy and allowing you to take dominant positions in the market. And in order to get that debt, you have to promise a better return to your shareholders than everybody else is doing. And so this drives this kind of maximization of profits for shareholders, which has become key to our economy, and I think has made it, not only really immoral, but completely unsustainable. And I think there are figures around, I think the Financial Times, actually, to some degree, a lot of the articles it writes kind of recognizes this. They recognize if they even want to sustain this system of capitalism, it needs massive reform, because this is very unsustainable. The corporations are effectively hollowing themselves out, and you see this with the pharmaceutical companies. So I did some work for the book looking at how much they spend on research and development compared to how much they hand back to shareholders every year. And I mean, there's no competition. The amount they hand back to shareholders is vastly more in most years for most companies than the amount they spend on research and development. Even what they spend on research and development is often, an extremely tenuous definition of research and development, and can often include mergers and acquisitions itself. There are some years where pharmaceutical companies spend more, returning more money to shareholders than they make in profits. And again, that's really interesting, because it's counterintuitive. How do they do this? And again, it's fueled by debt. But effectively, you know, they're kind of hollowing their corporations out. They're hollowing their own businesses out, all on the altar of maximizing benefits to shareholders. And I think the guy who for me really sums all of this up very nicely is Martin Shkreli, who some of you may have come across before. So quite a young guy. He became known as the Pharma bro because he's quite young and he likes hip hop. And he comes from the hedge fund industry, and he ran a hedge fund, and then he got out of that because he said there's not enough money to be made in hedge funds, and started a pharmaceutical company, which seemed like a better prospect. And Shkreli, you know, he really he epitomized the behavior of the sector in a really extreme way. He'd look for drugs where there would be a drug would be, you know, probably quite an old drug, but it would have a kind of monopoly on production of the drug, and he'd buy it up and he'd jack up the price and try and make as much money as he could before anyone else could get on the market. And so he bought this drug that was a really important parasitic, very nasty problem, particularly for immunocompromised people with HIV and so on. They depended on this drug when they got this nasty parasitic infection. And he jacked the price 5,000% overnight. And he immediately became kind of the most hated man in the United States. I mean, he united Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump in their utter condemnation of this guy's behavior. And he came back and he said, well, hang on a minute, you're condemning me, but actually my behavior is not that different to everybody else in this sector. This is how people in this sector behave. My job is not to make my shareholders a bit richer. It is to maximize the profits I can make for my shareholders. And, you know, he was asked, do you have any regrets? And he said, well, yeah, not raising the price higher, because I think I could have done. And that was a kind of insight into, you know, what is different between Shkreli and the rest of the industry. You know, sure, he seems to enjoy being a kind of pantomime villain. He does it with a grin on his face, and you know, he's clearly extreme in the way that he behaves. But there is a basic truth in what he says that actually drives the industry as a whole today. So, and one of the aspects that became really important to this industry that recognized they were so dependent on intellectual property and so on was something called the TRIPS agreement, which I definitely need to mention, which was a big agreement signed in the 1990s, mid-1990s, one of the first agreements signed by the World Trade Organization. And essentially what it did was extend US-style patent protection to the whole world. It said every country who's a member of the WTO has to adopt this. So minimum 20-year patents on medicines. Now this was a huge deal for many countries in the world. I mean, most countries in Europe until the late 70s didn't patent medicines. Britain didn't patent medicines until after the Second World War. It was considered not really the done thing. Very controversial. This is stuff that everybody should share. I don't know of any developing countries when TRIPS was being agreed in the early 90s that put these kind of patents on medicines. So overnight, but for the pharmaceutical industry, this was really important because we were coming into this era of globalization, global economy. We want to sell our products everywhere. We need the same monopolies everywhere around the world that we enjoy in the United States. But it was a phenomenally problematic deal. It was actually written to a large part by an ex-executive of Pfizer, but phenomenally problematic because all of a sudden everybody in, you know, global South countries who might want to develop their own pharmaceutical industries were suddenly pretty scared about what they would be allowed to do and what they wouldn't be allowed to do. And what had happened up to that point, why trade had been so important to many countries up to that point, is countries could just learn. If you're a developing country, you could just learn from more advanced economies how stuff was done. You didn't literally have to reinvent the wheel or pay the patent holder of the wheel an absolute fortune to rent it off them. You could learn, you could break stuff down, you could copy it, and you could come up with your own version. And that's how the countries that really developed in the 60s and 70s did so. The Indian pharmaceutical industry, incredibly important in the world today, still the pharmacy of the global South, developed in this way, pre-TRIPS. TRIPS cut that off. And by doing that, it really meant that countries were cut off at a level of kind of advancement, of development, so that they had to rely upon, you know, essentially selling cheap labor and cheap materials. And the terms of trade for the richest countries in the world that were able to enjoy the proceeds of these kind of advanced capital goods, the Western countries, they were vastly empowered by it. So it was a transfer. It was a transfer of power and wealth from labor to capital, from manufacturing to finance, and really importantly from the global south to the global north. And ever since then, there have been attempts, in numerous trade agreements to make that even harsher, to make those intellectual property requirements even harder, which has made it much, much more difficult for any industries to emerge, research, development, or manufacturing in other parts of the world. So that's the kind of global situation. And I mean, I mentioned earlier on HIV AIDS activists who were such an important part of the people's vaccine movement, and many of them, remember the enormous fight there was in South Africa, where in the late 90s, HIV AIDS was spreading very rapidly, was killing enormous amounts of people, despite the fact that we had a drug that could massively extend people's lives and prevent transmission from mothers to babies. And yet nobody in South Africa could afford that drug because the drugs were held through monopoly rights in the United States that then had to be applied in South Africa. Those drugs were $10,000 a drug, even though they could be made in India for $1 a drug. And a piece of legislation was passed by the ANC government that said, we would be allowed to import these kind of drugs from India. 39 pharmaceutical corporations took the ANC government to court and accused them of piracy to try to stop them getting their hands on these drugs that could have just saved so many lives. In the end, they had to back down thanks to international campaigning, including, I'm sure, by some people on the call here. But still, that sent a chilling effect in terms of what countries were able to do and not able to do. So it's had an incredibly serious impact on the global south. It's also had a serious impact on our own health systems in the West. Those of us from the West, I mean, there are drugs now that the National Health Service in Britain can't afford, despite the fact that some of the research that those drugs is based on comes from our taxes and comes from our public institutions. Despite that, we still allow that research to effectively be privatized, bought up and monopolized by Big Pharma, and we end up with drugs like Humira, an anti-inflammatory used for Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on, not created by AbbVie. AbbVie, the company that now owns it, bought up the company that created it and jacked up the price despite doing nothing to 470%. So in the United States, a branded course of Humira costs $77,000 a patient. It's a bit cheaper in the UK because we're able to negotiate. The NHS is better able to negotiate drug prices, but it's still an extremely expensive drug that cost the NHS over the last 10 years nearly £3 billion. So it's putting an enormous strain on our own health systems, even in rich countries. And that's one reason I think that this sector is unsustainable. And the campaign for change in this sector, I think, can win. And indeed, I'd argue, has to win. And I want to end in the last 5 minutes with just a little bit of hope of people around the world who are doing things differently. Because that's one thing I found out. And I think COVID really brought that to a head. So there's a great guy I talked to called Peter Hotez. He works for the Texas Children's Hospital. So he's an American. And he and his fellow scientists make vaccines for diseases that the pharmaceutical companies won't. And everything that those scientists do is aimed at making medicines which can be cheaply and easily replicated in settings without access to very advanced levels of medical technology. When the pandemic struck, Peter and his team started trying to make a COVID vaccine. And they did, and they set out to say this is a vaccine for the world. They got no money from Operation Warp Speed, the billions that went into that from the American government. But they did it anyway. Hotez says, if we'd got even a fraction of the support that, say, Moderna or other pharmaceutical companies have got, who knows, we might have been able to vaccinate the whole world. As it was, they did deals with India and Indonesia, and they have got out more than 100 million vaccines, which I think is still true. It was certainly true for a while, is more than Moderna sold to the whole of the global south. And he says, like, what we do is we license technology. We provide the prototype, production cell bank, no strings attached, no patent. We help in the co-development, and then the countries themselves and the companies that own it, they do it. We're hands off. We don't try to meddle in their business. We're very much a believer in this concept of decolonization. So that's a really nice example from the North. But there's an even better example, I think, from the global South. Again, a bunch of scientists got together in South Africa, backed by the World Health Organization in mid-2021, when they could see, the absolute crisis of vaccines in the global South, and they said, we want to work out how this is done. They approached Pfizer, they approached Moderna. Will you help us? No, of course not, on your bike. So they said, we're just going to try and do it anyway. And within a couple of months, they'd kind of cracked how to make the vaccine, essentially Moderna's vaccine. Of course, there's a lot of, it takes longer than just working out how to do it. You've then actually got to test it and trial it and actually do it. And they're still working on that. But they wanted to do it because they thought mRNA could potentially be a revolutionary platform for vaccines. This isn't just about COVID. So they're now working on a TB vaccine. You've got the possibility, they're saying, to make vaccines for HIV, for malaria, for certain types of cancer. So very interesting. So they wanted to have this technology in their own hands, not just in the hands of these big corporations. But then what they did was something really revolutionary. Then they said, we're going to share this with anybody who wants it and who we believe can safely use it. And they have so far shared it with 15 countries, the scientists of 15 countries, including India, Brazil, Argentina, so countries with the ability to make use of that in terms of production. Ukraine is on the list. There's a whole host of scientists have benefited from, and they are now collaborating around what to do with this technology and how to turn it into something that can be used to prevent the diseases suffered by most, vast majority of people in the world of whom hold no interest in the pharmaceutical sector because you can't make any money off them. So that is really exciting. And one journalist wrote about it. If all goes to plan, this hub could upend global vaccine production. For a growing number of people in Africa, it's not just that donations are taking too long to arrive or don't arrive at all, it's that they have to ask for them at all. So again, back to this idea of empowerment and decolonization. But then the last challenge I want to share, and I know there's a couple of people, at least in the room from the United States, is actually the challenge that's taking place to Big Pharma in the United States, in what I call the belly of the beast, really, because the pharmaceutical industry has been able to behave in the United States in the most atrocious way imaginable for a very long period of time, and it's got its way by convincing politicians. I started out saying this, but you might not like us. You might think we're profiteers. You might think we're greedy. But ultimately, imagine a world without medicines. And if you don't want that, don't regulate us, don't constrain us, don't negotiate with us. And that's worked for them for a very long period of time. But it's changing. And I know Peter from Public Citizen is here on the call, and I interview him in the book, and it's a great interview. I'd encourage you to read. But I mean, he said to me, today in America, from a position where we thought we couldn't win in this country because Big Pharma has 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress with huge amounts of power at a state level too. And have successfully woven this narrative around, we are the embodiment of innovation. It's really, really changed. Partly because of the opioid crisis, partly because, unlike us in Europe, for the most part, Americans actually know what their drugs cost because they see the price tag through their insurance schemes, if they're lucky enough to have insurance schemes. They realize what profiteers these companies are. And it's changed to the point where Peter says, today everybody hates Big Pharma. And that, that campaign was obviously built through the Bernie Sanders campaign when he ran for president. But I mean, some of that has been taken on by Biden, to the point where I was astonished in late August, I think, to wake up one morning and look at my Twitter, and Biden had tweeted, "This time we beat Big Pharma," and what he's actually done is passed a piece of legislation through the Inflation Reduction Act, which allows the American government to negotiate for the first time at a federal level drug prices on a certain amount of drugs. We certainly wanted it to go further than it did. One of the reasons it didn't was the ability of the pharmaceutical lobby to simply buy off congressional members. But nonetheless, he did get it through by one vote in the end, despite the fact that Pharma threw everything at it, threw the kitchen sink at it, and kind of sent this awful, chilling warning to Congress members, kind of saying, we're watching what you're doing. We're a very well-resourced industry. We will not forget how you vote. Nonetheless, they got it through. They are now beginning those negotiations. I think it's really, Peter said to me, this is really big, and you can't overstate how big it is for this country, even though, this is already how things operate in Europe on a bigger scale. For America, it's big. And I think the fact that 10 of the, 10 lawsuits now against Biden trying to stop him from taking away what they regard as their constitutional right to make as much money as they possibly can out of medicines, he's sticking with it. So I think that's exciting. And it isn't just at the level of the federal government. So in California, the state government recognized their insulin, which many Americans have to, despite insulin being a very old technology, many Americans have to ration the amount of insulin they take at great cost to their health and well-being because it's so expensive, because the monopoly's held on it. California said, we're not putting up with this. 100 million is going to go into cost production of insulin for everybody who needs it. And there are now 7 states looking at this as a model for how they can start to do things differently. And I think this shows just how serious the challenge to this model of operation is. And I hope, one of the things I wanted to do with the book, obviously, was use it as a campaign tool and hopefully persuade people that this is an area which is really worth investing some campaign time in, some activism time in, to try to change things. And ultimately, and I'll finish here because I've been going on for ages, what I say, and it's not going to apply to everyone around the world here, but certainly to those of us in the UK, we've accepted for a long time that our health system should be run in a public, a transparent, and a democratic way, free at the point of entry for all those who need its services. And I think many British people, for all of its faults, all the ways they've tried to erode it and take it away from us and privatize it and marketize it and all the problems there are with it, we still know that is the pinnacle in many ways of what a civilized government can achieve, and we're determined that they won't take it away from us. If we accept that that's how our health system should be run, why should the medicines dispensed in that health system be created and profited off in the most ultra-capitalist way you can possibly imagine? And so part of the book for me is to say really clearly, it doesn't have to be this way, to undermine those myths that keep the pharmaceutical industry's power in place, and to hopefully give people a little bit of hope and inspiration from the many people that I interview around the world, that change is already happening. Thank you.
Yes, many thanks, Nick, for the tour de force. This was a fascinating and very insightful presentation. Great stuff. Now, we've got already some questions in the Q&A function. And if I could just encourage all our listeners, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A function. The chat is also open, but there are many more contributions, and it's difficult to monitor the question in there. But the Q&A function should all allow you to pose your questions. So perhaps, Nick, if you do it like that, I give you one by one of the questions in the Q&A function, and then let you answer. If we come towards the end of the session and there are loads of questions, perhaps we take a few together. But for now, let's take it perhaps one by one. Yeah,
that would be great, Andreas. And I should apologize to people. I can see lots of things flicking up, questions and so on. Hopefully there is some Guy and others in the chat who can answer questions, but I can't. It's a bit difficult to keep on top of it. Also, I really appreciate you reading this out.
That is challenging. Yeah. So I've got a question from Hilary Haynes.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, I read there is a new agreement between NIHCE and Big Pharma. Is this good news or not? And when you answer that, Nick, perhaps if you could also explain what NIHCE stands for.
Yeah, so NICE is the body related to the NHS which looks at cost effectiveness. I think it looks at effectiveness more generally of drugs, but the bit I know about what it does is looks at cost effectiveness, and it's really, really useful actually, because it's the bit of the NHS that effectively allows us to negotiate drug prices. Because although these companies don't want to negotiate drug prices, if they don't meet NICE's criteria for cost effectiveness, those drugs don't get supplied on the NHS. And ultimately, of course, they do want their drugs to be supplied on the NHS because it's a very big market. So the cost effectiveness evaluation that NICE does is really important. Pharma hates NICE. I mean, they think it is, again, they think it's an affront to their right to make as much profit as they possibly can. And every year, the pharmaceutical industry writes this somewhat hysterical report, which is a 300-page piece of advice to the US trade representative, where they say, in trade talks with all these countries, this is all the terrible ways that we're being treated by countries around the world, and they always bring up NICE in the UK as a major problem that the US should put pressure on us to scrap or do away with or reform. So, but there are a series, and I think NICE plays a role in this, of agreements, voluntary agreements, between the pharmaceutical industry and the NHS, and there has been for a very, very long time, where they agree to somewhat limit the price rises that they can make from branded medicines once it's already entered the market, so that something doesn't become uncost effective, even though once, when it was originally agreed, it had been cost effective. So the pharmaceutical industry was really, so this negotiation was coming to an end. This deal was coming to an end, and it needs to be renegotiated. And the pharmaceutical industry saw this as a wonderful opportunity to scale back on the limits that were placed on the price rises of branded drugs under this deal. And they were, throwing everything at it. I mean, basically, a couple of companies, including Eli Lilly, I think, basically said, we'll just move our factories unless you allow us a bigger price rise margin on this stuff. And the government's been in negotiations with them. Now, they have just done a deal. We are still analysing the deal, I will say, so I can't give you absolute chapter and verse, but it is true to say they've done another deal which is positive in itself, and the other deal does not give in to everything that the pharmaceutical industry wanted. So I think even our government, as awful as it is, kind of recognises the serious unsustainable stress that what they were asking for would put on the NHS. So it is better. It is definitely better for the industry than it was. They have conceded some ground, but it's not as bad as it could have been, or that we feared it would be. One of the things in there that we want to find out a bit more about is they promise to put more money into research and development. And I think this is a real issue, because I'm all for the government putting money into research and development of new medicines, but that's got to come with conditions on public interest, and there's nothing in there, as far as I know at the moment, to suggest that's going to happen, and indeed it never happens, never seems to happen, and so I think that's one of the big things that we as campaigners in the UK at least can push for. If you're putting this money into research and development, then you need to make that conditional, at least on affordability and access, both here and around the globe. But actually, I would say you can begin to use that money to reform the patent system, which currently allows this knowledge to be walled off, enclosed, and in a knowledge economy, for me, that doesn't make any sense at all. So yeah, we need to do more work on it. But I think the feeling at the moment is not as bad as it could have been, but that there may be more we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. Now, the second question is from Bernie Howley. All through the pandemic, I kept asking myself, really, why has the WHO not got more power? Power greater than the industry giants. They were even stopped from going into parts of some countries, Syria, for example, where it seems like Assad only gave permission for access to certain regions. Global, the name is in the acronym. Shouldn't the WHO have more clout in the instance of a global pandemic?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, Bernie. And the story of that, which I do actually tackle in the book, is that unfortunately, from the late 1970s onwards, the WHO was systematically marginalized as part of the international infrastructure. This was an outright plan by the Reagan administration. I think it even started before him, at the urging, in particular, of the pharmaceutical companies. So in the 1970s, the WHO was doing some really interesting work. And one thing I'd like to reflect on a bit is I've talked a lot about medicines here today, and I don't want to give the impression that I think medicines are the sole answer to our health problems. Like, I don't think that at all. There are many determinants of poor health and good health. Medicines are only one. And I think actually one of the problems in the world is probably we focus too much on medicines as kind of I don't know if techno-fixes is the right word, but you know what I mean. As a kind of one stop, this is the solution, rather than land redistribution, decent work, decent sanitation, and so on. All these things that actually lifted living standards in Europe and North America. And the WHO is doing all sorts of work on this, determinants to health, and it was quite political in the way that it was talking about it. And in particular, it wanted to rein in a bunch of companies, and they did that with the tobacco industry. They took absolute lead in terms of kind of delegitimizing, I suppose, the tobacco industry. And they were about to start on pharmaceutical companies. And at that point, the American administration and American companies just said, absolutely not one step further. Like, we will not allow you to go there. And they kind of saw the WHO as far too radical in its politics as a whole, but particularly its politics with regards to corporate power and corporate monopolies. And there was an outright campaign to delegitimize and marginalize them. One of the ways that was done was the US in particular, but other countries too, to a lesser extent, removed core funds from the WHO. They said, we're not giving you core funds as a UN body. We'll give you project funds. So if you do this, which we like, fine. But otherwise, no core funds. And that was all very, very problematic, obviously, for the WHO being able to stand on its own feet and say what it thought should happen in the world of healthcare. But also meant that they became increasingly dependent on philanthropic foundations, of which the biggest, by a long, long way, is the Gates Foundation, which today I think it's true to say is still the second largest. It was nearly the first largest donor. And Bill Gates himself is treated like a head of state at the WHO because they're very dependent on his funding, and I think this is also just incredibly problematic. I mean, Gates himself has certain political opinions and whatever around patents and so on that I don't agree with, and I think it's been unhelpful. But even if he was the best guy in the world, I mean, it just isn't right to have one of the richest individuals on the planet being so powerful in setting health policy for the whole world. So that was a bit of a rambly answer, but I mean, I think lots of problems, but I think the central point is it was marginalized as a part of the infrastructure, and we got that back a little bit in COVID, I think, but it's going to take a lot more to rework the international institutions, and a lot of what the WHO was doing before that was basically handed to the World Bank as part of the structural adjustment period, and they were given immense power over healthcare, and obviously came at it with a far more pro-market approach than the WHO had done.
Thank you, Nick. Very interesting. So it's not just about the power of corporations in the pharmaceutical industry, but it's also how their interests have almost become internalized within the kind of institutional structure of the global economy. That's very challenging to go against that. I've got two questions by Sarah Gurley-Green. Sarah, I'm going to take your first one, then move forward, and perhaps if you have time at the end, also move to your second, just to try and cover as much as possible. So the first question is, what is the role of DTC, advertising in US, on the power of Big Pharma? DTC, Nick, you aware of what it stands for?
I'm not, unfortunately, no, sorry.
Okay, so perhaps, Sarah, if you just could add that, and then we get back to that. Yep.
Yeah, and it might well be that some of my colleagues from the US also are direct to consumer. Sorry, yeah, direct to consumer.
Good.
Yeah. Were you going to ask me another one, Andreas, or shall I come back to that one first?
No, that's good then.
Yeah,
so what is the role of DTC advertising in US on the power of
I mean,
Big
it's
Pharma?
big. Obviously, it's big, yeah. And obviously, the fact that we have managed to constrain that somewhat in Europe is a positive thing. I mean, I'm always shocked. I think you're always a bit shocked to see European going to North America and seeing some of the pharma adverts. You just think, it seems really inappropriate. And so of course it plays a role. And as I say, some of my US friends may want to say more on that. But I do also think there is potentially even bigger issue in the US, which is the way that they are allowed, the pharmaceutical companies are allowed to market to doctors, which I mean, in some cases, I think amounts to just corruption of the medical establishment. And I mean, again, anyone who's seen Painkiller will know how problematic that relationship is. And that was actually a technique that was devised by Arthur Sackler, who founded Purdue Pharma. He wasn't there in the OxyContin scandal. That was his nephew. But this was a guy who back in the 50s and 60s basically created the marketing arm of the pharmaceutical industry. It made Pfizer a fortune by creating a blockbuster around its antibiotics. He was the marketeer behind Valium, the enormous Roche blockbuster in the 70s. And he invented lots of different techniques which are interesting to study. But I think the key one was get inside the mind of doctors, because doctors and health professionals are figures of trust in society. We trust them more than we trust adverts. I'm not saying adverts have no impact, but we they are figures of trust and we believe them. And that, I think, is so problematic. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen here. It does happen here. It's not as extreme. It is more constrained. But I mean, there was an article in the Observer a few weeks ago talking about the way that doctors are advertised to and convinced here as well. So it is also a problem.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. So I've got a comment by Barbara now, and she writes, in the 70s and 80s in my local Whole Food shops, there were very frequently different petitions regarding farmers pushing governments to not allow herbal and natural remedies to be sold. It is now very difficult to buy these remedies, similar to Monsanto, etc., making it very difficult to buy food seeds. There are also interesting comparison with the global agricultural food processing industry, which is another area similar to pharmaceutical, where these huge corporations play a disproportionate role. Nick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's right. And although there's TRIPS isn't quite as big when it comes to food, but there's another agreement which is kind of similar, which yes has had a terrible effect on allowing companies to come in and buy up traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, knowledge that people have used for centuries in some cases, and market it. And I think that's definitely been done with some herbal remedies. I'm not an absolute expert on this, but the one area I did look at a little bit is magic mushrooms, because the active ingredient in magic mushrooms is increasingly being looked at as a solution to mental health conditions, and it's had some considerable success apparently in tests and trials. And that this has created a wave of attempts by investors to patent aspects of anything you can imagine. They can't patent the thing itself because it's natural, but they will try to make changes and patent those changes. They will try to patent just about anything you can imagine. And the most ludicrous ones, which were reported, were about trying to put patents on the methods you use to dispense in a therapeutic setting the magic mushroom ingredients. So one of them is, to be dispensed in rooms with soft colors and soft furnishings. I mean, just very basic stuff about therapy in general, which they've tried to patent as a method of so that essentially they will in some way control the sale of this substance if and when it becomes legal. And some of the investors behind that are, for example, Peter Thiel, this really big Republican financier in the US, ultra libertarian, multi-billionaire. So it's really interesting, and I'm sure. I mean that I read about, and so I know about it. But I'm sure similar processes have happened around other herbal ingredients that they find to be effective, and then find ways, as you say, to essentially control markets in them.
Thank you. There's a question by Peter Selle. He asked also what views you have on the Gates Foundation. I think you've already answered that, Nick. But then he also asked, what do you think, Nick, about the fact that pharma can get products approved on the basis of clinical trial results that are ghost-written, where the trial data is not shared with other researchers? Pregnant women nowadays are being recommended 7 different vaccines that have not been adequately tested for safety. The Pfizer COVID vaccine was tested on just 44 pregnant rats. Was that something you were looking?
So I looked a little bit at this, because I think you're right. This comes back to kind of what we touched on earlier, which is I think a lot of people know that Big Pharma are big lobbyists. One of the most powerful lobbying groups certainly in the US, but also in Europe, they're fairly powerful too, and they spend a lot of money on lobbying. But actually, and this isn't an original thought, a writer called Dominique Tabel, writing in the US, comes up with this idea that they're actually more than an external player on the state. In some ways, they've become integrated, important functions of the state, and this is what really gives them their power. And those functions include, the medical establishment we've talked about, academia, the regulatory process, which this question goes to the heart of, whereby, they have found all sorts of ways of getting around the constraints that the regulatory process should be putting on them. And all of this needs looking at. There's a story in there where I interviewed someone called Nancy Oliveira. She is a scientist, a medical researcher from Canada. And she was working on what she thought was a really great drug. She works on a very rare blood disease. This drug seemed to be very helpful for her patients. But then halfway through, she discovered it was having a very, very dangerous side effect on, I think it was on the liver of people taking it. And she tried to inform her patients. She informed the guys that owned this patient, the drug company that owned this patient. And they said, you're absolutely not allowed to disclose this to anyone. You're not allowed to talk to your patient about it. And she said that, well, that's ridiculous and outrageous. Of course, I'm going to talk to the patient about it because it concerns, her health. And they went to town on her. I mean, she was sacked from a university, which had also taken money from this company. She was discredited by them. I mean, they pushed her to the edge, and she fought back. She's just won an award, which I went to her award ceremony a couple of months ago for sticking with this cause. But it's really shocking. I mean, she had death threats written to her and stuff. It was really, really shocking, and it showed me just how far they'll go. In fact, she was people may know The Constant Gardener, the John le Carré novel about the industry. He based some of it on Nancy's story. So her story's in the book and is inspirational. And I don't know if that adequately answers the question, but I mean, I agree. The case was well put.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is from Evan Sedgwick Gell. I'm a mental health researcher working on the political economy of mental health care. I'm interested in the way that a profit motive disfigures research science in and of itself. For many years, the industry pursued the neurotransmitter thesis, trumpeting the targeted nature of the interventions in brain chemistry of drugs like SSRIs. From the 2010s onward, they've quietly abandoned further R&D due to limited provability of their efficacy, as it's too big a risk. However, a baseline has been set in mental health care where the prescription of these drugs as the dominant and often sole approach to treat conditions such as depression continues. Are there dynamics that you see as specific to psychopharmaceuticals, and what forces exist to ensure research uncorrupted by the profit motive?
Oh, such a good question. I mean, and it's almost a comment in itself, and I totally take it. And I think one of the problems is also, the other, we talked about determinants of health, but the amount of time that doctors have got, for example, in our health systems, means that very often there's not much you can do other than write a prescription for a drug, and then someone goes out of your office and you've given them something. So, I think there's so many ways of kind of approaching this topic. And I should say as well that I'm not against drug interventions, but I think you're right. Like you say, it's the problem is it's kind of often the first and last. And then, as you rightly say, those drugs that are produced, are produced because somebody somewhere thought this could be a blockbuster drug. Essentially, there's a friend called Els Torrelly who set up the Médecins Sans Frontières Access to Medicines campaign, which is a brilliant campaign. So much great research into this stuff, and she started out as a researcher of chemical compounds that could be used for drugs. And she said, well, in the end, I had to leave and do something else and become a campaigner because I just couldn't accept, of all the stuff I was working on, the only thing that was ever going to make it through was something which a pharmaceutical company thought they could make an enormous profit from. It wasn't about what chemical was the most effective in treating what disease. It was simply the equation at the end of the day. And this was for somebody who didn't work for one of those companies, but she knew the only way this stuff would get taken up and turned into a medicine was if one of the big corporations bought it up. And they would only do that if effectively they thought there was a good chance it was going to be a blockbuster and make a huge amount of profit. So of course, you're right. I mean, that massively distorts what you're going to be looking into, what you're going to be taking up. I mean, there's a story in there where sometimes they don't, that there was Pfizer bought up a company. This company had just a ton of research on its books. Pfizer didn't even really, they bought it up because they thought they had one or two things and they used those things. But then there was just a whole bunch of stuff just kind of sitting in the back office. One of which many years later proved to be extremely useful for the treatment of, I think it was either the treatment or diagnosis of breast cancer. It had a huge effect. But I mean, for 5 years, this has been sitting down, and it was only kind of accidentally that some researchers heard about this and asked them about it, that it ever came to light. So, yeah, it's the incentives in the system are wrong. I mean, that's the number one thing I want to get over with this book. The incentives are so perverse if what we care about is healthcare. And to be frank, this goes beyond like whether people are, for me, it's not about whether these people at the top of the industry are good people or bad people. It doesn't make any difference. The incentives are driving things in a certain direction. And we've got to change those incentives if we want medicines that are created in the public interest.
Great. That answer in a way leads into the next question by Giles Manning, which does actually pose a bit of a moral question about the people involved. And he asked, this to me seems to fundamentally be a question of to what extent incentives are needed to create value. What has your research shown you about the actual value creators and scientists being fussed or not fussed about earning crazy money?
Well, it's a good question, and I wouldn't like to come up with a definitive on that, because obviously, the people I've spoken to are speaking to me because they have a certain view. Even if they've worked in pharmaceutical companies or been medical researchers, they have they have a certain view and they have certain ethics that they want to guide their work. But if those people are anything to go by, my impression is, there are a lot of really good people out there, many of whom work for pharmaceutical companies, some of whom work for universities, whatever. Who are kind of working away trying to produce something, but the incentive for those people, and I'm sure it's like all of us, they need enough to live on and they want a reasonable paying job for what they're doing. But the incentives of those people, it is not often those people who go on to become the executives or shareholders in these companies, right? They're different. They're a whole different set of people. So from what I've seen, they are doing a job, divorced from, in many ways, the people at the top of the industry. The problem is when they're told to start something or stop something for reasons, as they say, that strategically are not about the big diseases. But I mean, I've not come across many people who wouldn't want to work on those things if they were able to. I really, and some of the scientists as well, they're a bit, I think they're genuinely quite perplexed by some of the way that the patent system works, and say, they get more than anybody else, right? This is not, it's not one person. One person doesn't create a complete breakthrough in medical knowledge. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. There's a woman who really, as much as it can be pinned on anybody, she was absolutely vital in mRNA technology, and she spent 2 decades, barely having a job. I mean, they just defunded her and they thought what she was doing was rubbish. And she just has this lovely quote about mRNA technology. It's really great that it seems to work, and so many people have played a little role in it, including me. And I think it's what's so shocking and wrong about that is the way that can just be kind of bought as private property and used to make other people vast sums of money. Because my experience is not that's what drives the scientists who are involved in this kind of stuff. Interesting comment on the collectiveness behind these kind of inventions. There was recently the Nobel Prize was awarded. It goes to individuals, but I was wondering, what about all the people around these individuals and the kind of research they build their research on? It's really an individualistic kind of endeavor. Very interesting. Before we get to the next question, I give the floor to Guy from Global Justice Now. Guy, you wanted to make an announcement. Is that a good moment for you to do so? Putting you a bit on the spot there.
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. Just a word of thanks to start with. It's been a real pleasure working with Andreas and Oliver and others, and to mount this meeting. And I hope the numbers attending and the quality of the debate we've heard have been sufficient reward for that partnership. I've certainly had a lot of learned a lot, even more from this, despite hearing Nick talk about his book on a number of occasions. I just want to announce a couple of things, which I have said in the chat, but in case you haven't seen it, we are offering a free book to people who join Global Justice Now tonight. There is in the chat a link. I'll post it again after I've said my bit here. If you join for £5 a month or more, we'll give you a free copy of the book, and we might even get Nick to sign it. Who knows? If you are a member, or you can think of some valid reason why you don't want to join Global Justice Now, you can buy the book for only £15 from us tonight, and that is postage and packing included. Again, there'll be a link which I post after this. But I just want to say that we're not just an organisation with an inspirational and a very knowledgeable leader. We have groups of activists around the country, some of which are in this meeting at the moment. One thing which hit me, I'm the bloke who organises alongside the groups and what have you. I got a WhatsApp message just yesterday from some of our activists in Bradford who'd just been let off actually on a court case, having obstructed roads over climate change. And this is another one of our major campaigns. We fight on pharmaceuticals, on trade issues, on and overall on monopoly capitalism. And there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to do, and I'd implore you to join in. We have inspirational people from our membership, through our staff, to our director, and you can link up with these people wherever you are around the country. So do look at our website, do come along and join us, and try and get involved in what we do, because I think as we're learning tonight, we can really make a difference. So I'll just leave it there and start putting links in the chat for you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Guy. That's great. It really shows the whole connection. The start, of course, is the research and to reveal all the knowledge and present the knowledge as you do, Nick. But then, of course, we also want to make a change. We don't just want to criticize the faults we see in front of our eyes, but we actually also want to change. And it is great that Global Justice Now has this kind of network of local groups who work on that, on the topic of your book, pharmaceuticals and the pricing of it, but of course a whole range of other issues too. So that's fantastic. So thanks a lot for that, Guy. And that allows me now to go to the next question. is a bit more general, but I think that gives you also the chance to emphasize what you think is the most important issue. So what do you think is the most pressing issue in the realm of healthcare justice in the UK, Nick?
In the UK?
What's the most pressing issue?
I mean, for me, and like I should stress at this point, I am not a scientist. Nothing I should be taken should be taken in the vein of medical advice. So there may be all sorts of things going on that I don't know about. But I think for us in the UK, as I've already said, I think the fact that we have a free at the point of use health system is just so vital in creating a more equal society, in the trust that we need in healthcare, in the kind of way we think about, the communal nature of society, that I think we need to protect it at all costs, because if they erode it any further, if they privatize parts of it, if they force people, who can afford it to take private healthcare, so it becomes a two-tier system, I think the impact of that on the healthcare that we receive, how marketized that is, and on the equality of people who can receive that healthcare, it would just be an absolute disaster. So I think it's just something we've got to, and I know people are, doing everything they can think of, because many people feel like this as well. And none of this is to say, as I've already said, it's perfect. It needs to be much better in so many ways, and we should also, have that vision in mind and campaign for it to be better. But I think, to assert the principles of that system seem to me absolutely vital, and it's something that, as an international organization, we've also been holding up to other places to prove you can actually do it like this. And in fact, when it is introduced in other places, it is just as hard to take it away from people. It was done in Thailand, I think in the 2000s, where they introduced public service healthcare, and although successive governments have wanted to get rid of it and take it away and marketize it, they've not been able to do that. So I think it's there's something really, really important in there.
Excellent, thank you. The next question, I think also interesting, refers us to Cuba. Amelia Mills asks, is Cuba involved in research and production of vaccines, medicines that are affordable, especially for countries in the global south?
Oh, they are, and I'm pleased you asked that, actually, because I forgot to mention it. But whenever I forget to mention it, someone asks about it, so that's great. So Cuba was very inspirational, and I mean, obviously, part of the thing with Cuba is it's been under an embargo for so long that it's had to become self-sufficient in many things, and it's always seen healthcare as extremely important for the same reason I think as the NHS is important to us in equalising society. So they actually have some great research and development, and as well as doctors and nurses, which they're famous for, and they invented 3 effective COVID vaccines during the pandemic, and they vaccinated their entire population, I think, before anybody else did. It was very quick anyway, and it was almost blanket. And there's something really interesting in what they did. They used quite an old technology, that old-fashioned vaccines, but they seem pretty effective, and they did that for a good reason. They didn't want to go in for the mRNA stuff because it was untested. And I spoke to a scientist there, and he said to me, I think there's something to learn from this. Like the reason that you got mRNA vaccines, and he wasn't saying they're ineffective or they're problematic or anything like that. He said they're good vaccines, but the reason you got them is there's an incentive in the system for big business to invent something which they think can be a blockbuster. And so that's new technology. It's very interesting that the big vaccines from the West were those kind of new technology vaccines, because actually, again, it goes to the core of, companies actually thought that's where they could make most profit. Whereas in Cuba, they said, well, we wanted something a bit more tried and tested. We also wanted something which we knew would be safe in kids, because they also vaccinated kids in Cuba, which a lot of us haven't done. But they said we wanted people not to be worried about vaccinating their children, because we could see that it wasn't very severe for most children, but that wasn't 100%. And also, children are carriers, so they used an old technology that they thought would be safe. So that was really interesting. And I should also say on that, it wasn't the case that you have this image of Cuba where you think, okay, it must have all come out of a massive bureaucratic research center. It didn't. It came out, the different vaccines came out of different institutes, and there was a degree of competition between those institutes, but it's not competition based on the kind of property rights of, patents that I've been talking about today. So I think there's a lot we can learn. I think, it's a great shame, actually, that, and the World Health Organization does probably bear some blame here, that the Cuban vaccines weren't taken more seriously internationally as well, because I think that they could have provided, a positive way that other countries could have got access to vaccine technology earlier.
Interesting. Thank you. The next question is also very practice-oriented, I think very good within our forum here. Indigo asked, as someone, I just popped the chat up, I've got to get it off. As someone going into a career in medicine and health, is there anything that my peers and I can do to help protect global health from Big Pharma? Very concrete question.
Yeah. So depending on what you're, I think if you're going into the NHS, for example, as a doctor or other health worker, I've met so many people on the tour who, and some of them come up to me, particularly the GPs, and say, yeah, that was great, but it's much worse than you're making out. So that's really interesting, and I think I actually think we need to try and find some way of networking such folk together, so that they can work out how to protect themselves and the health service more from the industry. If, on the other hand, you are going to be a medical researcher, and I've come across quite a few medical researchers doing this tour as well, there is a great new project which is coming out of it. There's a think tank called Autonomy, people might have heard of, and they are creating a network of medical researchers and indeed other science and technology researchers who want to do things differently, because a bit like the story I said of Els earlier, somebody who went into this and wanted to produce, medicines to deal with the worst diseases in the world, and then found that, it was basically about what could make money for Big Pharma. I think a lot of researchers feel like that. So they've got a network where they, and there may be some advocacy involved in that, because I think, you could be a valuable advocate, particularly when trying to convince, the Labour Party and so on. But actually of also setting up potentially setting up independent research institutes to do some of this work as well. So I definitely, get in contact with them, or get in contact with me, and I'll put you in contact with them.
Brilliant. So unfortunately, we won't have time for all the questions. It's always good to have, shows the engagement, and in a way reflects very positively on the presentation, of course. But I think there is a very good question to finish off with, focusing on campaigning and where we should target our campaign. So it comes from Russell in Turkey. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm wondering, what do you think about changing the system? You mentioned campaigning. Is the end goal to achieve legislative policy change, or to contribute to changing social norms as to what is considered acceptable behavior by pharma? And should this take place at national level, or would a European or international initiative be more effective? I'm thinking of the EU Pharma Package and the Pandemic Treaty. We are trying to change legislation in the Netherlands to impose a duty of care on pharmaceutical companies, and hoping that if we are successful, other European countries will be inspired to follow suit. Sorry for the long non-question. I think it's actually a very good question.
It's a great question.
I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I think, Nick, that's a great question to finish off.
It's a great question.
So over to you.
Yeah, and I think basically we need to campaign, locally, nationally, and internationally, and everybody needs to do what the bit of that they think is most effective. But we wouldn't want to campaign just nationally and then find out we built a wonderful system for ourselves, but nobody else saw any of the benefits of it. So, but I think your point about the EU is interesting, and I think there's going to be a big conference next year, but I need to get in contact with the organizers again, who were talking precisely about, there is actually quite a bit of conversation going on at an EU level around changing making changes to this system. And there's been some very interesting papers discussed in Parliament. I mean, this hasn't got to the level of, this is about to happen or anything, but they are certainly conversations that I don't think would have happened before COVID. And I know that some Dutch groups, in particular, I think it was a Dutch doctor who was part of the organising of it. I had heard about that, and I'd also heard about a case in the Netherlands where there was a legal case against the drug I mentioned, Humira, the anti-inflammatory. There was a case brought about the profiteering off that drug and how that had damaged the health system, which was really interesting as well. And I think absolutely we need to do more, and it's one role my organisation can play to kind of network between these different groups and learn from each other. But I think if you're an activist, an individual activist within your own country, you might be in a different position. And if you're in the UK at the moment, for example, it is likely that there will be another government within the next year. They are setting their policy stall out at the moment. There is some interesting stuff in there, including more research in medical R&D, but I haven't seen a lot about how you could use that research through putting conditions on it to change the system fundamentally. And I think we've got to do a huge job of work, basically, to convince and pressure them to go in that direction. And I think those of you on the call who are involved in either medical research yourselves or the healthcare profession can play a particularly important role there. Well, pandemic preparedness treaty, absolutely. So that's going on internationally, and we'll set the terms of how we deal with the next pandemic. And there is a huge battle going on there, particularly around things like patents and how important patents were as an obstacle or how important they were. So there's more work that we need to do there. There's a wonderful group that I will give a shout out to. There's many wonderful groups working on this, but there's a wonderful group for those of you in the UK, because I know most of you are, a patient group called Just Treatment. And Just Treatment is wonderful. It works with patients to try to challenge the pharmaceutical industry's profiteering and force them to reduce their prices, but also more generally to get government to issue compulsory licenses for certain drugs and so on when they're unaffordable. So they're an absolutely wonderful group to support. And Dearden from there really helped me with the book. So I mean, there's plenty to do. I don't think there's one answer to the question, and I think the way you set it out was that's how I see it as well. There's different elements, different layers. It is definitely not going to work just by people like me writing books or bits of excellent policy. It will only work when enough people see the threat, see the problems, get engaged, and force politicians to make a difference. And I have seen a huge upsurge in people wanting to do that since COVID, which is why I think it's a really exciting time, particularly because the changes in the US and so on. But yeah, I mean, I'd say whatever way that you think you can be most useful to this struggle at whatever level, please get involved. And if we can help with that, let us know. And if there's something you think we need to know and change, let us know.
Brilliant. What a positive note to end on with. Yeah. So that leaves me with the final task. First of all, of course, to thank you, Nick, our speaker, for the fantastic presentation, but really also very engaging question and answer session. I think it was fascinating to see the various aspects which could be revealed. So many thanks to you for that. A fascinating annual lecture. Many thanks to Global Justice Now, to Guy, to the team, for co-organizing this event with CSSGJ. My thanks to Oliver, who was the technical backup on our side for this evening's event. And of course, also many thanks to you, the audience, for being here, for engaging and for posing such engaging questions also to Nick and making that event such a successful but also enjoyable annual lecture seminar. So thanks a lot, everyone. Hopefully to see one or the other of you again in the future. And many thanks again to Nick. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you very much. And thanks, everybody.
Cheers, Nick. Bye.